I have said, and will probably say this many more times, exposure is the holy grail of photographers, and it needs to be something that is second nature to us. We know that between each of the exposure settings within either the shutter speeds, the apertures or the ISO, there is just one stop of exposure. We are either halving the exposure between each setting or we're doubling it, depending on the direction of change. Here we need to look at the correlation between shutter speeds, the apertures, and also ISO. So here I'd like to take a look at the correlation between the shutter speeds, the apertures, and the ISO in that exposure triangle. Now allow me to rearrange the screen here because I want to show a number of exposure settings together. And I'd like to start with 250th of a second at f8 with 100 ISO. And I want to use this as our control exposure. It corresponds to the correct exposure for this image. Now let's take a look at another exposure starting with the shutter speed. What I've done here is to increase the shutter speed to a 500th of a second, and that of course restricts the light falling on the sensor by one stop, or we could say it's half the light. When we look at the aperture here, you can see that I've changed that too. I've opened the aperture wider from f8 to f5.6, and we can see that reflected in the graphic on the left. This has allowed more light to fall on the sensor by one stop. It's doubling the light, in fact. So what we've done here is to reduce the amount of light falling on the sensor with a speeding up of the shutter, and we've increased the amount of light falling on the sensor by opening the aperture. The net result is exactly the same from an exposure point of view. We get a well-exposed image. The amount of light captured by both those settings is actually the same. Now let's add another set of values to our list, and first of all look at the ISO down at the bottom here, which has been increased to 200. Now that's a one-stop increase in light captured by the sensor, effectively, once again, doubling the exposure. To compensate for that extra light, I need to either speed up the shutter one stop or reduce the aperture to f8. I chose to adjust the shutter, and the exposure effect on the image remains the same as the other two examples. Moving on to my next example, I've selected 125th of a second, and that slows the shutter and allows in more light. But how much more? Well, it's actually 3 stops because we've gone from 1000 to 500, which is one stop, 500 to 250, which is another, and then to 125, making 3 stops in all. Now I haven't changed the other settings just yet, but we would have to adjust one or both of the other two to compensate, to give us our correlation of the correct exposure. Now I've chosen to take the ISO down to 100, which is the logical thing to do, and that gets me back one of those 3 stops, but that's as far as I can go with ISO. So I need to reduce the aperture 2 stops, and 2 stops from f5.6, well, 1 stop is f8, 2 stops is f11. But that gets our exposure back on track, and we get a good result. As I move on to the next example, I've only changed the ISO. I've increased it to 400, which effectively adds 2 stops of light to the sensor. Now as we reach this point, I think you can probably see what I mean about being able to understand the exposure triangle, to have all 3 sets of values in our head, but it'll come, don't worry. We have to reduce the light falling on the sensor by 2 stops. So let's speed up the shutter speed to 250th of a second to reduce the light 1 stop. Remember, faster shutter, less light. Then we can reduce the aperture to f16, which again restricts the light falling on the sensor by 1 stop. When we look at the image, the exposure is correct, because in all of the 5 variations of our exposure triangle, the light falling on the sensor is the same from an exposure point of view. Now I have a little bit of space left in my example, so let's add another. Suppose we were photographing a fast-moving bird in the same lighting conditions. Let's select F4, which I've already done, and you can see that reflected in the graphic over on the left. Now I've gone from F16 to F4. 16 to 11 is 1 stop, 11 to 8 is 2 stops, 8 to 5, 6 is 3 stops, and then down to F4 gives us 4 stops in total. Now when we look at the other 2 settings, ISO and shutter speed, we have options here. We have 4 stops to play with, so we could spread those between the shutter speed and the ISO by first increasing the shutter by 2 stops to 1/1000th of a second. We could then reduce the ISO from its current 400 to 100, and that's going to gain us the other 2 stops. Now the result would be a good exposure. Now with the bird being in motion, being able to set 2/1000th of a second shutter speed, if we can, by just increasing the ISO to 200, that may be of benefit to stop any movement in the wings of the bird. So the light falling on the sensor that resulted in both this image and the other is always the same. And finally, coming back to our exposure settings, let's reduce the shutter speed to 250th of a second. That is 3 stops more exposure than the 2000 I previously set. Now we can reduce the exposure for 2 of those stops by reducing the aperture to f8, and we can gain the last with the ISO. And here we are back at the start, 250th of a second at f8 with 100 ISO. This is the exposure triangle at work, and a correlation we need to understand.